our own city. And who better, I thought, to ask than William, who is actually the chairman of the Athenaeum, but also probably the single most knowledgeable person about Plymouth business and social scene, but we'll leave that till later. I always enjoy talking with William because in my day job, I'm an academic. I look at politics and international relations at a national and international level. William can always draw these connections down to what's happening in Plymouth, and it's always really informative, and I think it will be for everyone tonight. We're just going to do this in a conversational way. We'll take quite a few breaks for questions. If you're online, please put any questions or points in the chat. Also be aware, if you're online, that this is being recorded, so you might want to turn your video off. So William, welcome first of all. Thanks for doing this. I mean, to begin, March 2020, I think I felt, like many people did, great sense of foreboding, obviously, in many ways, but also economically, I thought, oh God, we're heading for some kind of Great Depression type event. And it didn't, although it's been very tough for everyone, and there's been real suffering, it didn't quite turn out like that, at least yet. And anyway, I just thought I'd ask you about that, this catastrophe, economic catastrophe that didn't quite happen, and what was going on in Plymouth that month, if you remember.
Yes, well, good evening, everyone in the room and people at home. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. It's been a fascinating 2 years. We first heard about COVID probably around about this time 2 years ago. And of course, it was all in China then, and then it built and came to Europe. And then, as Patrick said, it hit us in about March 2020. And I think we went into lockdown on the 23rd of March. It was emblazoned in my mind. And like a lot of people, like Patrick said, I really did think we were going to be pitched into like a depression on the scale that the world saw in the 1930s. It looked really, really scary for quite some time. Within a few days of the lockdown being announced, I started getting phone calls and emails and messages from people who are being made redundant. And this happened almost straight away, around that time, on the 20th, 23rd of March, from small firms, from people working for big firms. It seemed that some companies were so frightened right away, they immediately started making people redundant. And I talked to a couple of companies about this, small ones, larger ones, and they were all very much saying, please don't name us at the moment because we're panicking. Nobody knows what we're doing. We're getting rid of any staff that we can, because we just think all our income is going to cease. Within a few days that stopped, and the reason it stopped is because the government started taking action, and they stepped in particularly with the furlough scheme, which has probably been the single biggest success of any government initiative, certainly in COVID, quite possibly for decades maybe. At the height, in June 2020, there were 30,400 people in Plymouth. That's just in Plymouth on the furlough scheme. That's incredible. That's an amazing number. There was also 8,200 claiming self-employment benefit as well at that time, or their relief. You're talking of their 40,000 workers. That's, we've got a population in the city, what, about 260, 270,000. The working population is probably half of that. You're probably looking at maybe half the workforce was in real danger of being made redundant, of losing their jobs, which would have pitched us into a depression, which probably would have rivaled the 1930s. And a lot of those workers were on low incomes. They were on 0 hours. The one that is on record that I wrote about and made a lot of national headlines were the workers at Cineworld, which had not long opened here in Plymouth, but they were virtually all made redundant apart from a few managers in the whole country on the day that lockdown happened, and they formed an action group because they weren't entitled to any redundancy pay, they weren't entitled to any support because they were on 0 hours. Now, when the furlough scheme came back in, the other amazing thing we saw was an immediate set of U-turns. So the small company, a couple of small companies I spoke to in that first weekend who'd made people redundant were going, please don't do a thing, we're panicking. By the Monday or Tuesday, whenever furlough was announced, they were saying to me, we've re-employed all our staff and put them all on furlough. So it prevented a mass unemployment, the like of which this country hasn't seen for nearly 100 years. And that was, for me, that was the initial fear. But it was a fear that we all had, even myself. I went into a redundancy process. My employers made a lot of redundancies, which now they've backfilled, and we've actually got more employees working for Reach PLC who employ me than we had 18 months ago. So it really was there was a lot of panic, but it wasn't a disaster that was averted.
Yeah, like you said, really successful government intervention. When it came to it, it just had to be the government. Nothing else could stand in. For Plymouth, of course, the year 2020 was supposed to be a really exciting year because the Mayflower 400 celebrations that have been spoken about for years beforehand. And then, well, it seemed that this was not tenable or couldn't go through. Could you say something about that? What happened? Yeah,
well, a year ago, I wrote the review of the year for the Westmoreland News Annual Business Guide, and I remember my first line was it was supposed to be Plymouth's year, and 2020 it was supposed to be the year of Mayflower 400, which was touted as our city of culture type experience. This was going to put us on a global map, and it was going to bring a lot of success to Plymouth, the eyes of the world. Now, we missed all that. A lot of the events that were planned have actually since happened. The box opened. It opened almost just over a year ago, September 2020, but late. And then, of course, we went to lockdown again, so we locked down again. But Look 2 was built, the Mayflower ship was launched. We had finally the hatchling finally happened this summer. A lot of the big events happened, but they didn't get that global attention. And this is where we have lost out, I feel. Those events, though, were pretty successful, but they were kind of successful in a small pool. They were successful in Plymouth. The figures that I saw for the box in its first year, it had over 100,000 visitors, which was really successful. Considering a lot of that first year, it was actually shut because we were still in lockdown until, was it April, I think, when it was last open. So it did well to have 100,000 visitors. But an initial survey in the first quarter of that year showed that 75% of the visitors were from Plymouth. So I guess probably a few more came from outside the rest of the year, but it shows that really the Mayflower celebrations were kind of probably ring-fenced into this area. I guess you would probably struggle to get much information out of someone from another part of the country about them, which is a shame. But that's not to say that the events that happened were a success, and we've got that legacy now, particularly with the box, which does seem to be a success and does seem to have struck a chord with local people and will probably pay dividends over time. Yeah. I mean, the box is great. I remember going in there for the first time. I'd heard Tudor Evans, then council leader, talk about it with great enthusiasm years ago, and then obviously the opening was cancelled. But it was great to that foyer and the figures there. It's incredible. It may be a slow burn, I think, and gradually catch attention. It did get quite a bit of media attention when it opened, but of course people couldn't then go and see it from outside the area. So we'll see how it does, but I guess it possibly could be a slow burn, which might actually be a better thing. Yeah, and some might say more local economies might be a good thing, which is a much bigger question. It's
came from COVID, just geography really became more important because for much of the time you weren't allowed to travel far.
Yeah.
But, so that must have had an impact as well. Maybe that helped Plymouth more than in other areas. But, yeah, and the council obviously had a major role, even though it's in the UK, it's always the central government making the big decisions about money and budgetary allocations for the furlough and other kinds of relief schemes. But do you know what exactly was the role of the council? They seem to me to perform it well from a non-expert kind of eye. I've always thought Plymouth's been a relatively well-run city, actually, from an outsider's perspective. Lots of people here complain. But what was your impression?
Well, I think the council actually did a really good job. They basically administered the government support that came in. Particularly there was numerous funds set up. I have some figures. They actually paid out, this is central government money that flowed through it, they paid out £92 million to businesses in Plymouth. It's a staggering figure, really. That money it was made up of 19,435 individual payments to 7,440 businesses. So you think about nearly 7,500 businesses needed government support, and that money was flowed through the council. So it was a huge logistical exercise. They had 50 council officers working full time on this, doing nothing but supporting, paying grants and checking people who were eligible for grants and what money they could have and this sort of thing. It was that they just, I think it was Nick Kelly, one of the councillors described it as a Herculean task, and they weren't wrong. It was a job in itself. But when you think of all those businesses, we talked about the furlough money, but the actual number of businesses that needed support was staggering. It's a huge number, and that's the ones eligible for the grant schemes. There was actually 16 different grant schemes, all sorts of things, small business things. It was just loads of them. It was actually quite complex, but that does take into account all the businesses that then took advantage of things like the Sybil scheme, the business loans, and the large business loan scheme. There was, these sort of things, and self-employment relief. So there was an awful lot. But the council did that, but it also had a kind of had a reassuring role to play. That it was there to have stability at a time like we thought we might be pitched into this economic crisis. I read something by possibly not the greatest, the person to go to comment on the state of the economy and society, but Jeremy Clarkson, very early on in one of his columns in the Sunday Times, very early on in the first couple of weeks of lockdown, where he was predicting riots, people not paying their council tax, people food fights, over supermarkets, running out of supplies. And it was quite a gloomy column. I mean, it wasn't joking. He meant this in all seriousness. He was very worried. And I think, maybe it was a bit extreme, but that captured, I think, the fear that a lot of us had in those early days, that we're really going to be pitched into a very tricky situation.
Yeah, talking of that comforting role, I remember one Tuesday was in March, kind of waiting, wondering, would the bin men come? Because that was the kind of the sign that things were still thinking, and they were a bit late, but they came. By God, I was relieved. I was never so happy to just waving at them out the window. Yes.
But that's true. There actually were fears of that because, as Clarkson said, people will stop paying their council tax, and then you have the breakdown of services. And then the council itself, about early part of this year, when they were setting their budget, they said they had lost £20 million of income because of COVID, from companies not being able to pay business rates, a lot of it, because business rates were put on hold, I think, weren't they? And just businesses that went bust, this sort of thing, people who just couldn't pay money they owed. It hit them, but again, they took a hit and they survived. But they had that, they kept that reassuring role, that stability, and there was a lot of the public services did that. Everyone collapsed the NHS, but the police as well. You know, they kept society going. We didn't descend into anarchy, which some people thought might happen.
Yeah, I realise we're probably not cheering people up a great deal, but human civilization is, when you think about it, it's quite fragile. It depends on all these intricate things working, energy, refuse, and economy, and so on. So yeah, that was a real fear. Yeah, let's open it out now to the audience. So people have any questions, anything you wanted to know. I'll repeat for those on Zoom, even though you might be able to hear. John,
do you think that Plymouth is in a good place if a second wave hits the economy?
Okay, I'll just, that's it. Is Plymouth in a good place if a second wave hits the economy?
Yeah.
You mean a second COVID?
Yeah, second COVID, yeah.
Well, I mean, we can talk about this now. You know, as Mark Twain said, the future is very difficult to predict. The future is very difficult to predict, especially when bad things haven't happened yet. Something like that extent. And he was right. We don't know what's going to happen next year. I was talking to a businessman in Berlin today. He was in Berlin, I wasn't. But we were on the phone to him. He's doing stuff with companies in the southwest. That's why I was talking to him. And they're very worried there that they're going to be put into a full lockdown in 3 or 4 days' time. We don't know. There was actually the first story I've seen. It was either on the Times or the Guardian today saying, will Britain go into a lockdown? We don't know what's going to happen. I think the government have spent so much money on supporting the economy through the first lockdowns and series of lockdowns that they want to avoid everything to do with going into another one. It's not to say we might be pitching some sort of restrictions, or maybe we'll be told to work from home again, maybe COVID passports. We don't know. It's very difficult to know what will happen. But I think the Western economies have shown that they're resilient enough to have withstood what we've been through in what's been, it was probably a greater scale than the financial crisis and touched more people. But we have come through it. Now, the way the indices are going at the moment, the national economy and the local economy seem to be recovering very well. We had all these talk about, we don't hear much now, V-shaped recovery and double V-shaped recovery. Now, I don't know what it actually turned out to be, but it probably is a bit more V-shaped if you're looking over 2 years. There was figures out today. There was a PMI report today, which says nationally, growth is going very well. There's a lot of confidence from companies, but there's a lot of challenges ahead. There was also a business confidence report for Southwest that was out today. I wrote about the ICAEW report. And again, it says companies are very confident, reporting high sales at the moment. There's a lot of consumer confidence. People are spending money. Now, whether this is because money they've saved up during lockdown, that's one theory, or it's just they're just so relieved they can go back and doing things and they just want to get out and do stuff again. That's another theory. But that there is that happening. But that's not to say there aren't a lot of challenges, and the big three that companies are looking at the moment is inflation, energy costs particularly, and that all filters through to the price that we're all paying for goods. A huge employment problem, and it's one that we've not had in this country for a long time. We haven't got enough workers. And a company I was talking to today is the umpteenth one I've spoken to recently in different sectors saying we can't get people. We have all sorts of, and we're paying well, and we're offering this, we're offering that. We just cannot get people to apply for jobs with us. The third one is supply issues. So manufacturing, Plymouth manufacturers are actually doing quite well as are nationally. They've got a lot of orders and sales seem to be going up, but the problem they've got is they're not hitting those orders and production is down, which means actually sales are down. So even though they've got a lot of people wanting to buy their goods, they can't actually sell them because they can't produce them. And part of that is there's all those reasons, but part of that is the supply chain issue. They can't get components here, and when they make things, they can't get it to people because of logistics problems. And you know, to use the dreaded B word, Brexit hasn't helped either, particularly for exporters to Europe. So it's a bit knife edgy at the moment, the economy. You know, things are looking good, but there's challenges ahead. And of course, and we just don't know what COVID is going to do to us in the next couple of months. You know, as we hit the real difficult part of the summer, business I was talking to today was saying that's what he was worried about, because as we hit the colder weather, more people are indoors more often. They tend to have heating on, lack of ventilation. This is when the real COVID spike will come. So if we haven't had a really bad cold patch yet, but if we hit a cold patch in December, January, it could pitch our COVID rates to the levels they're seeing in Central Europe, like Germany at the moment, which is probably what's fueling their problems. Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions for now from the floor or online?
I've got one, William. Obviously, difficult times also provide opportunities, and we've all seen on a national scale companies, industries that have profited through COVID. Are there any examples you could tell us of local companies that have actually profited and thrived as a result of COVID, of things they've been able to do and exploit opportunities?
Well, there certainly is. It's a very up-and-down picture for companies. There's a lot of companies that are actually doing quite well, but there's like three types really. There's companies that got hit very badly and haven't recovered from COVID and have gone under. There's companies that have been hit very badly but have recovered, but they've still got that big hole to fill of the lost income. And then there's people who've actually sailed through it and actually done really well. There's, a big example of doing very well is the range, Chris Dawson's range. Now, their results were out only 2 weeks ago. Their profits for, I think this was a half year, were £145 million. And they tripled on what they were this time, like 2 years ago, I think it was. Now, they stayed open as an essential trader. Now, all those companies that were able to stay open, are interesting to the range because they're headquartered in Plymouth, but all those sort of things, B&M, Wilko, the supermarkets, not only did they stay open, people had to shop in them because other retailers were closed. So they did really well. And also people who did have more disposable money because they couldn't buy other things, spent perhaps a bit more money in the supermarket. You know, you're not going to out and buy a new set of clothes because you've got nowhere to go because you're at home. But so why not treat yourself to more ice cream or crisps or whatever? Yeah. So those companies have done, they did really well.
The range is what again? It's outdoor.
No, that's outdoor. It's just homeware. It does all
Homeware.
sorts, yeah.
Okay, like home.
So, yeah, all household goods basically. But they also were able to. They had a partnership with Iceland, so they've got Iceland stores inside their big stores. So they sold food as well. So yeah, it's a very interesting point about the range. And some of those types of stores, they could sell items which, as part of the package, which were they not selling food and toilet rolls and this sort of thing, they wouldn't have been allowed to sell if they were just doing that, because it wouldn't have been deemed as essential. I think Lawson's, which sells only homeware, I think she had to close, Liz Lawson, all her outlets. She could only sell online, yeah. But she did hardly any online beforehand, she told me. About a year ago, I interviewed her. It didn't quite make up for loss of the shops being open during the lockdowns, but it actually created an online business for her. She hardly did any before, and then online went really well. There was a lot of companies that realised they could sell online, and a lot of people like restaurants who didn't do takeaway suddenly found out they could do takeaway, and it was really successful. And a lot of them continued to do that once the lockdowns ended. and it was a new stream for them. In fact, it caused some of them a headache because they had to produce twice as much food, so they had to employ twice as many people. Some of them had to put in new kitchens or open another unit just to fuel the takeaway business that they'd grown. So there was a lot of smart moves by companies who found new ways of operating. But yeah, some people who were allowed to operate did very well. A lot of our manufacturers who were allowed to, do you remember they closed for a short period of time, then they were told they could open again. A lot of them continued almost as if nothing had happened. You know, if provided they could get enough people onto their production floors, and a lot of factories already have safe working, you know, and distancing for other safety reasons. It didn't affect them too much.
What about a company like Becton Dickinson who provide syringes?
Yeah, I think BD did very well. I've not seen their results, but they were obviously selling into the pharmaceutical thing. In fact, they did do very well because the demand for their products went really high. They do blood vacuumators, I think they're called, for collecting blood. So there was a huge spike in demand for that. In fact, I think they had a problem that they couldn't reach demand because they had a supply issue. But yes, there was a lot of food producers. All the Burt's sales were, they went up hugely during lockdown. They hit £57 million worth of crisps. And that was despite taking a hit from hospitality being closed. So they sell a lot in pubs and cafes and things like that. But their supermarket business went really well. So again, there was a balance there, and they came out all right out of that. So yeah, there was winners and losers. Just see if I've got any other. Plymouth CMO Stores, which was doing well already as it sells like DIY and trade stuff to builders, and they've always been an online business. So they were going great beforehand. They just took off even better when people wanted to order stuff because they didn't want to go and collect things. Yeah. So there was a lot of businesses that they were already digital or going digital who were able to take advantage. And like I say, ones who were selling things that people could still buy that they wanted, they could stay open. They all did really well.
Yeah, you mentioned obviously the online thing. I think a lot of people would like to know what's the future for Plymouth City Centre. Obviously, Debenhams went over this time, and people fear it will become derelict, or maybe shops will be replaced with other things. Any ideas? Well,
yeah, the city centre is a very interesting proposition at a very interesting time. Now, again, I was quite worried what was going to happen to city centre before COVID. And then when COVID happened, you started thinking, are people going to come back? Or have they got used to shopping online? Is that going to kill off footfall? And also the element of, undesirables, if I can use that word, moving it. There was a lot of street drinkers in the city centre during COVID. Now, that's an issue for society to deal with, but if it gets out of control, it can put off shoppers in families. Yeah. Now, Plymouth City Centre is at it's transforming quite well at the moment. There's a lot of, you probably see work that's started in there already. So the council is spending millions on revamps of the city centre. It's got several schemes at different stages. They're working on the Old Town Street and down the top of New George Street at the moment to make the environment there more modern and better. There will be work starting in the new year on the Civic Square, which is outside the council house. That will feed into some future work that will happen in Armada Way, which we're yet to have full details of, but all these schemes will eventually link up. And then you've got, so there's a lot of investment going in. Also, the city centre is being bookended by two huge capital projects. The Brunel Plaza at the railway station, the work has started there on the university's medical block, which was in the old office tower there. Now, British Network Rail, come back 30 years to British Rail, so Network Rail, they've already put a lot of investment into the concourse there. There's going to be a lot more going in there. They're going to revamp that. Eventually, the multi-storey car park's going to come down. There's going to be a hotel there. There's going to be a new multi-storey built. There is going to be some potentially future university buildings that have yet to be announced, other than that they've said there's some packages of land they want to build on. That's going to be a huge gateway to lead into the city centre. And then at the other end of the city centre at Colin Campbell Court, there's work plans. Planning application is out for consultation at the moment on the health hub, the Health and Wellbeing Centre that will go on Colin Campbell Court. And that will be the first of a series of the developments in that area that the council are looking at, which has got potential to revitalise the bottom end of the city centre. I was reading not that long ago about the impact that new hospitals make on the economy around them. And this isn't exactly a hospital, but it is a health centre which will attract a lot of people. They're open virtually almost 24/7, and they attract people all day long, every day, 7 days a week. So they bring an awful lot of footfall, not just patients, but people taking people, taxi drivers, workers, all this sort of thing. That will undoubtedly have an economic impact on that area. So there's a lot of investment going into the city centre at the moment. I wrote last week, you might have seen it, the Debenhams building is very close to being sold for more than £3.5 million. Now, I don't know who's bought it yet, but whoever's paying that amount of money has got a serious plan for it. So that building will be in operation fairly soon. I would imagine they're not going to sit on that, I would have thought. There is investment going in. It's transforming. There's a lot of new uses. We've had some strange, wild and wonderful things that opened in the city centre, from churches going into the former Lawson's building in the top of, is it Cornwall Street, to people chucking axes at things. There's some unusual uses, and there's more probably to come. Probably more food offerings, I would guess. Probably some more unusual ones. I see that the back end of Woolworths, which has been empty for now since it shut in 2009, I think it was, and Poundland went in the front part. That has now got a sort of foreign food branding going up in some sort of supermarket, which fits in with those sort of exotic food places that are going into Cornwall Street. That, I think, is quite significant. A unit that's sat empty for 11 years, 12 years now, is going to be back in use. People are, they're looking to go to create new things. And just like the recession gave a spark for a lot of new businesses and new ideas, the COVID time has. We actually I've had two studies have been out on small businesses setting up in Plymouth. And the Grosham is a company that looks at helping small businesses. In just the June 20 to 2021, they have recorded that there were 1,500 startup businesses started in Plymouth. So that's a lot. In January to June 21, a different report has put 634 were registered at Companies House. So that's about half. So it probably is about 1,500 in that year. Now, there's probably been more since then. And not all of those were created by businesses, people who'd lost their jobs, or companies that had gone under and other people had, tried something else. They think that the furlough scheme probably has actually sparked a lot of new business ideas. People went on furlough sometimes for months, and they sat at home and thought, do you know what, I've always fancied doing this or turning my hobby into a job. And it's quite possible that a lot of those registrations maybe the person's gone back to their job, but they've started this as sort of a side hustle, you know. But some of them will be new jobs that they've created, so new businesses they've created just to work in. So it could, you know, who knows what could come out of that. But clearly, not all of them will survive, but some sustainable and probably growing businesses will have come out of the COVID period just because it gave people an opportunity.
Yeah. But back to the council. So as you explained, council is actually quite powerful because even though it's the government's money, it was distributing it. So that's real power, isn't it?
It does, yeah, it did. And I don't think they made any redundancies. I don't think I remember. Yeah, the public sector performed pretty well throughout the whole pandemic. And in fact, there are some business people who feel that it actually may have benefited from the way people started working hybrid or from home, and then it actually slimmed down and smoothed a lot of their procedures.
Fewer meetings.
Fewer meetings, you know, decisions made. We've got to make this decision now. With the private sector, certainly the company I work for, and other companies have said this to me, probably 5 years of digital change happened in a few months. Plans they had maybe for people to work at home, work hybrid, new software systems, all these things that they were looking at doing, they were suddenly forced to do in a short period of time. They did it and they went, do you know what, that was nowhere near as troublesome, as traumatic as we expected, and has produced results earlier. It could well be that the public sector took some slimming down and quicker decision making because it had to, and has actually looked at it and gone, do you know what, this worked really well for us. This is the way future. We might get some better government out of this as a result. But yeah, the public sector did step up, and it seems to have worked pretty well throughout this.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the education sector, people were saying for years, decades, I remember reading in the 1980s how all education would be online or by video, they would have said, and so, but it never happened. But then because of the pandemic, it did, basically because we have to go online. But it transpired that most students actually wanted face-to-face. Now this varies. Master's students and people working were happy enough doing it online generally, but your traditional undergraduate students actually wanted traditional face-to-face classes, which is interesting. So in the future, it's going to be hybrid. It's not completely transformed. We'll continue to do some of the online stuff, but it's still going to be, the core will still be old-fashioned classes of a sort.
But I think that flexibility is worked in across a lot of things as well, not just in education, but in other companies and, you know, the public sector as well, that hybrid. Some people can be at home, some people can be in, people can go in when they want, they can stay at home when they want, you know, they can mix things up, yeah.
Yeah, Patrick, you've brought up education. It's something I was going to ask you. We're in one of the city's leading education establishments here at City College this evening. Patrick, you are an associate professor at Plymouth University. I was wondering if you could share a little bit of your experience of the pandemic from an education perspective. You touched on a little bit of it, yeah, in terms of the student side of it.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. First of all, Zoom was great because we realized we can actually do this. You can deliver a lecture, certainly, at least the traditional lecture, which is, you know, you talking and displaying materials, and that can actually work well. In some ways, it can work even better, as you can obviously share screens and show clips and videos more seamlessly than you could probably do in a lecture. For getting interaction for people, though, it varies. It's more difficult. It takes a lot more work, whereas if you're in the room, say, you can make a joke and try and get people to talk, you know what do you think about, what do you think about Trump, this election, what do you think about Brexit, and so on. Quite informally, that will normally work with a class of interested students. Online, it can go very flat. You're talking into this flat, empty space. So you have to think, you have to put more work into it to think of activities and even some of those gimmicky things where you write on the board here or something like that. And that's so that can be hit and miss. But definitely the potential is it's very striking. It's also, yeah, I wasn't one of these people who had extra time in the pandemic, actually. It's a lot more work because, again, during lecture, some of my time will be spent delivering jokes of maybe moderate to good quality, spinning my theory, or some interaction, I suppose, banter. Again, that doesn't really work, and you are, of course, you're being recorded. And if you're doing like a sensitive subject, like I am, politics, and so that means, whereas I normally would not have typed out notes and that, I would start to do that and do prepare it more. So in the future, I mean, some of my colleagues are pre-recording lectures now and just having classes for discussion. I haven't quite got still kind of doing it simultaneously, like we're doing tonight. But we're still, I think it's fair to say, we're still very much feeling our way as to what's the best thing to do, what the students want, and what obviously what fits the guidelines as well and the regulations. But yeah, certainly it was, like Will said, it was a decade's worth of change in a week, and we kept the show on the road. But you obviously can't replicate the classic student experience where, you know, we all know you go into college or university you want to go to lecture, yeah, but you want to do other things as well. And obviously the online experience won't capture that. I myself did a training course online, and I found it worked perfectly well. You know, this was all just professionals that just wanted this technical thing. Did you have a question?
Yes, William. I think I read one of the articles about Plymouth having could have one of the first marine parks in Plymouth Sound, and I'm thinking of again, I don't expect you to look into crystal ball, but there were rumours of passenger liners coming into the Sound, and the facilities being built for them, and also to link to that, the developments of the Dockyard, which is sort of the heart of Plymouth industry. So with those three things in mind, and this very sort of nautical maritime theme, is there a danger that COVID-19 might stifle that investment in such a way that something that Plymouth really depends upon for its future?
Let me just repeat for people, because John's a bit far away. So a question about investment in nautical issues, areas like passenger liners and the dockyards redevelopment.
Yeah, I remember the exact words of the Mark Twain quote. It was, predictions are very hard to make, especially when they're about the future. That was it. Yeah, there was also an economist once said, he said, there's a two types of prediction, lucky and wrong. So it's difficult to know, isn't it? I think now I made a list of things like reasons to be cheerful about things that were coming up, of which the National Marine Park is one of them. I still think people are yet to really get their head around what this will mean. And it's very early days yet, but I think it's got potential to do a lot for Plymouth and bring a lot of people here. You mentioned the Dockyard Development. Now that's interesting. There's a £1 billion development. That's the next 5 years. But there's a longer chain than that, going for 30 years. And Babcock, they were one of these companies that had a V. You know, they lost a lot of money when, although they could operate, the restrictions they were put on really hit them, both in the dockyard here and also in their other operations in other centres up in Scotland and other things. They do mass and more work than just refitting ships and submarines. But they're back in, they're still making profit. Their profits, I think their quarterly profit came out, was it a couple of weeks ago? What have I got here? 118 million. Oh, they took 118 million hit, but their recent profits were 115 million half-year profit in Babcock. I mean, it's not bad. It's down, but it's still massively profitable. What one thing about that these firms have learned to do is they learn to live with COVID and work. I went into the dockyard a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, to look at how they were doing the refits on the frigates. And that work had been hit, but they were still going ahead and they were catching up. They worked out ways of working shift patterns, you know, this sort of thing, so they could still continue to work and stay safe. Now, again, it was probably 5 years worth of changes forced on them in a couple of months, you know. But you mentioned things there like the dockyard. There's a huge redevelopment of Telford Hospital coming up. This stuff has been planned and the money is already secure. So I can't see it being, you know, badly affected by, even if we're pitched into another bad COVID winter. What was the third one you mentioned? There was
about the passenger liners.
Now the passenger liners, of course, that's different. Now they are predicting. Last time I wrote, it was I think 11 liners coming in next year. There could be more than that. They had 11 booked. They're looking at creating this sort of berth at Mill Bay on the pier there, the Trinity Pier. It's potentially a money spinner. It's not a money spinner in the terms of redeveloping the dockyard or Derriford Hospital are going to be for Plymouth's economy, where you're going to have tens of millions of pounds spent. But it's something, you know, it's good. It's going to be good for hospitality. But of course, that could be hit. You know, if those boats can't come, then it's going to be a blow. And we are not so much in Plymouth, but certainly in the southwest, very hospitality led. It was a huge blow to them. They've had a very up and down couple of years. St Austell Brewery, who is one of our most successful companies, their results were out recently, and they had made a £10 million loss after I only had the figures going back 5 years, but after 5 years of making profits, growing every year, off around £10 million profit or more a year, they suddenly went into a £10 million loss for 2020. Now they've probably gone back into profit this year, but they still can only open from April, you know. But there was a boom of staycationers and this sort of thing. You know, that release of pent up spending. But we are very hospitality led, so there is a danger. There's a danger to certain areas of the economy that if we are pitched back into not just even a lockdown, but restrictions, the Scots are getting very worried because I think they're getting Northern Irish because I think they've got restrictions coming in, COVID passports, and certainly their hospitality companies are getting very worried up there. How that's going to affect them. I think we're just going to say we're not going out at Christmas because we've got to, you know, it's just too much hassle. So there are fears for next year, but it all depends. But we just don't know what's going to happen, do we? This is the thing. But then that in itself, that is the biggest problem that businesses have. They love certainty. They hate uncertainty. They would rather, sometimes they'd rather know that they're going into lockdown than not know we might go to lockdown, we might not. You know.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So two small questions. Is it possible to disentangle the effects of COVID and the effects of Brexit? And the other thing is quite different. I've noticed what they're doing in the city centre. And, you know, the big thing that just hit me was taking away the trees, boom, as usual. Are there plans to replace the trees with interest and make it into a city, a green city, as well as a seaside city?
Yeah, let me repeat briefly. So can we disentangle COVID and Brexit for their effects and the redevelopment of the city centre and the destruction of trees, and will they be replaced?
Well, I can't speak for the
Not
council.
just replaced, but is there a plan to make it?
I can't speak for the council.
Make it green.
I mean, I know we wrote a story recently. I didn't write it. That there is removal of the trees for that development. But as I understand it, that development also has new greenery put in. So I don't know enough about it. They do tend to, people get very excited about cutting down of trees, and often it's diseased trees or old, you know, trees are not very good condition and they're replaced. But really, that's a question for the city council. And I can't really answer that, I'm afraid. I would hope, particularly after COP26 and all that, that surely greenery is at the forefront of their minds. But I know there's other projects in the city, like Seagrass project in the Sound, things like that, that they're doing a lot to try and balance, the environment. It's difficult to, I can't really say enough about, because I don't know enough about what they're planning in that particular thing. We need to really ask the council that. COVID and Brexit, though, now that is a really good question, because they are separate, and they have both had impacts. And a lot of businesses that have suffered have said to me, we've suffered because there's very few that say have suffered just because of Brexit. And there's also few who say have suffered just because of COVID. What it tends to be is that COVID caused a lot of problems because people just couldn't operate. I mean, Brexit hasn't stopped people operating, but it's caused them issues. But both of them are causing them continued issues, if you know what I mean. And a lot of the issues that are particularly hitting companies at the moment are related to both those things. So the skills and employment issue, there is a lack of workers, there's a lack of skilled workers, and there's various reasons for this. Brexit is undoubtedly one of them. And a lot of companies, they don't like to say it because they get a lot of, knockback on it, but they do admit it. Brexit has caused them a lot of problems. A lot of EU workers went home. They can't go to the EU as a resource for workers to fill in gaps. It has caused them problem. COVID has also caused them a staffing problem. Some people just took retirement and went, you know what, I've had enough of work, I like being at home. Some people, like I said, started their own businesses while they were on furlough, for instance, and that gave their jobs up. But there's also been, so COVID has affected that. I'm sure, I don't know what the figures are, it's possibly too early in care, this double jabbing thing. We've yet to see what effect that's actually had, but it could be a lot of people have given up working in the care sector, which is already under pressure because they don't want to be double jabbed. And, so that's a COVID effect. And that sector is undoubtedly being affected by Brexit as well. So, but there's also other things too. And, a company I spoke to today has had issues with employment, and several of us have said this to me. There's been growth in other areas which have sucked workers away, particularly delivery jobs and warehouse jobs. Also, though, retail has bounced back a little bit, and we've actually seen some companies operating on the high street again. But the supermarkets, particularly, I mentioned the range and the supermarkets, they've employed a lot of people. So people have been, sucked into those jobs, into delivery jobs. People like Deliveroo, Just Eat, these people. I was talking about how restaurants that weren't doing takeaways suddenly started doing them. They created a lot of jobs.
I think good jobs, though.
Well, this is another issue that employers are constantly now telling me that we're going to start suffering from inflation because a lot of that is because of wages. Wages are going up. Every employer is saying to me, we're paying people more. And even those, what we consider often to be low-paid jobs actually aren't as badly paid as we think. And one big Plymouth employer said to me last week, they said, we're losing people to the likes of Aldi and Deliveroo and that, because actually the amount of money they can earn isn't that bad, And even though some of the more established companies will pay more, it's not always about work, it's not always about money. It's about shift patterns and flexibility and this sort of thing. And some of these, these jobs can offer things that are, and sometimes, some businesses have actually said to me, they're easier jobs. People don't want the stress and strain sometimes of doing certain jobs, perhaps in that, especially the health, things like that, where, they can be doing, sort of delivering pizzas and not having to think about it and going home at the end of the shift and not being exhausted, and even though it's paying a bit less, it's, you know, they're seeing it's worth it. That has definitely seems to have sucked people away. And in the delivery thing, logistics, we're seeing it a lot with, you know, the struggle that they've had recruiting bus drivers and keeping bus drivers here, because they can go and work for Amazon and get paid sometimes more, but also they can actually choose their shifts. You know, they don't have to be on that, you know, 6 a.m. route that has to be delivered. They can go and do, we can work what we want. And some people, they like what I'm hearing today. There's, particularly with the delivery jobs and that, there's people opting to do these like 12, 13-hour days, but only do 3 or 4 day weeks. And they can do that, and they actually like that because, you know, in fact, what this one businessman said today, he said we've had trouble getting people, you know, because they've been going to that, because they go, oh yeah, I can deliver, I can, you know, do deliveries for 13 hours a day for Monday to Thursday and have a 3 day weekend, you know. And it's all these things we're doing. But so it's a very complex situation. But undoubtedly, you can entangle them, but they're both having a serious effect, COVID and Brexit.
Yeah, I think we're coming to the end, but can I ask you about your job as a reporter this time? There are a couple of angles in terms of what it was like. A, obviously you don't want to impress people too much, but you do have to report what's going on, but also doing your job. I'd imagine I'd much rather interview someone in person than on Zoom, because you know, you get the body language, maybe you can persuade somebody or elicit more from them than you would get in a kind of online interaction. How have you found doing your job? Well, I suppose it's more normal now when you're back to meeting.
It's a bit more normal going out to see people again. We did an awful lot of interviews on the phone always, so we were used to not seeing people face to face. Like a lot of people, I'd never Zoomed before the lockdown happened. I did one today with a chief executive of a big company, and the advantage of that was he's not down here, so I could see him face to face. But I could have done it. I could have done it on the phone. Would have done it on the phone a couple of years ago. But it's a nicer way of doing it. To things. So visited factories, building sites, you know, companies, offices, this sort of thing, developments. That all stopped, and that was a shame because it's an enjoyable part of the job. But also, you get a better feel for things when you're looking at it. But also, a company that wants to show you their new production line they put in isn't going to ring you up and tell you about it. They want you to come and look at it. So I didn't get those sort of stories, you know, and I'm starting to pick up things now. People come to me going, oh, we made a big investment 6 months ago. You know, now do you want to come and have a look at it? You know, they didn't tell me about it at the time, this sort of thing. So it did affect me quite a bit in that way, but it was a really busy time because so much was happening. It was affecting everybody. So it was really, you know, it was really, really busy. I was really worried that the news was going to stop when we went to lockdown. And the only news we were going to get all day was like how long the lockdown was going to go on. But actually, it got more interesting because everyone was affected by the lockdown, and people, you know, were losing money because of the lockdown, and people's effects on people's mental health because of the lockdown, and the new things, and you know, people got on their pelotons and all this, and you know, because of the lockdown, and you know, all the changes it brought about actually gave you a lot to report on. So that did change it a lot. The big difference change for me was I started working from home, and I'm still working from home. But you know, it works all right for me. I'm quite happy doing that. Like some people can't wait to get back into offices, newsrooms, or wherever. Some people like to do a bit hybrid. Some people like to stay at home. That flexibility has been created now. I think it'll be very difficult to reel that back again to the way we were working.
Yeah, well, thanks, Will. We better end it there, but sincere thanks. Like I hoped you've given us some real insights there, not just how business, but society is kind of changing, and some positive things to think about as well, about how adaptable we are in businesses and society is. So thanks everyone for coming, and
Thank you, Dad.